As your programs grow in size, it becomes unwieldy to have all of your code stored in a single file. And so programming languages have ways of breaking your programs down into multiple files and being able to reference and reuse the contents of one file in another. So for example, we can define a function that we have used throughout our project. It's maybe called a utility or a helper function defined in one file. And then from another file where we want to call that function, we can just import it. Well, in this video, we're going to look at how we import not only functions, but also entire modules in our Python programs, and talk a little bit about the mechanics of it in terms of how to do this in the REPL, using interactive programming, how to do this in stored programs, as well as a slightly more nuanced way of importing functions and using helper functionality in Jupyter notebooks. So let's jump right into an example. I'm going to go ahead and set up a file named helpers.py. And just as a reminder, I'm going to be doing this sort of intentionally within a directory. And in Python, we think of directories as packages and Python files as modules. And modules are things that we can import. Okay, so I'm going to set up a blank Python file and just say example functions that can be imported elsewhere. Okay, make that a little bit larger. And let's just define two very silly functions. So shout is a function that you give it a message string, and it's a procedure. It doesn't actually return anything back when you call this function, and all it's going to do is print message.upper. So call the upper method of the message string, which converts that string to uppercase, and then print that out. All right, so a very simple little method. Let's define one more, just for good measure. Whisper, that's the opposite of this. So whisper, you give it a message, and what it's going to do is print the lowercase version of that message. Right. So we've defined these two functions in a module named helpers in our lessons package. How do we actually use these functions in other files or other contexts? Well, let's try starting up a REPL. So I'm going to open up a new terminal and get into a Python, start my Python interactive programming REPL. And now we can try calling the shout function. And if you try calling a function, let's say shout hello, as you should hopefully expect, we're going to get an error. We haven't defined this function yet, and we also haven't imported it. So how do we import this shout function? I want to show you two ways. First, I want to show you how we can import the module and then access the function through the module. And this tends to be, the best practice way of importing things and what you typically want to do. So let's try this out. So we can say from, and then we give the package name. So lessons dot, and then we give, from lessons, we're just going to import the entire module. So from lessons, import helpers. All right. So again, lessons is the package. It's the directory that our Python files are stored in here. And helpers is the module. Press enter, and it looks like nothing's happened. But now if we were to say, well, what is helpers? And we would see that it's the module, lessons.helpers, and we can see that it's imported from, and then your location on your computer is going to be different than mine, but this is telling us where this file actually was when it was imported. Great. So how do we call a function defined in a module that we've just imported like this? Well, we could try saying helpers dot, and then within this module we can access anything that was defined in its global space. So helpers.shout hello. And boom, we've just called that function. Similarly, just to convince ourselves that both functions were imported, helpers.whisper hello. And we'll see that everything was converted to lowercase, right? I want to show you how we can import specific functions, but we're going to need to do that in a stored file, and we'll make some documentation there. So let's jump to that first. This is everything that we can do in a stored file, we can also do in the REPL. This is just a quick example of what's going on here. And to demonstrate that we can do this with interactive programming, this is kind of nice to go and test out functions as you're working on them. So let's go ahead and set up another module, and I'm going to name this module example of imports.py. And in this module, let's just go ahead and say from lessons, import helpers. Right? And for good measure, let's add a doc string. So examples of importing modules and identifiers, global identifiers. I'll come back to this. Great. Okay, well, since we've imported this module, just like we saw in the REPL in the terminal, we should be able to use its functions now. So helpers.shout, this functionality was imported. Okay, so if I save this module, notice the definition of this function is in a completely separate file. What I can do is go and try and run this example. So Python, run the module lessons.example of imports. Boom, this functionality was imported. And so notice we're able to import functions defined in another file or module into other modules. And this allows us to compose larger programs and have the functionality be logically related within the files that we're writing. It's common to have helper functions that we use sort of as utility functions throughout many of our programs, and we'll be seeing this in some of the examples we do later in this course. Great. The next thing I want to demonstrate is the ability to import specific functions. Typically, and let's actually go ahead and make a note of this. So import an entire module and access names in that module following the dot, right? So we use this dot operator to say, okay, we're talking about the helpers, which was this imported module, dot, and now we're talking about things that were defined inside of helpers, and then we can call shout. It turns out if we wanted to, we could have declared a constant here. And as an example, this might actually be worth having as an example. So let's declare a constant, like say the answer, which is an integer, and that's 42. And so this is a global constant that we defined in this module. Well, we could also print helpers dot the answer in this module, right? Once we've imported it. And so not only are functions accessible to us, but anything that lives in our globals frame, if we were to think about what happens when this program or when this module is evaluated, whatever names are accessible to you in globals of this frame will be accessible to you when you import that entire module. Right? We'll come back to this a little bit more explicitly in just a moment. We can alias a module. And let me talk about this before we go on to importing specific identifiers from a module. All right. So this is common. So we could say from lessons, import helpers as HP. Right? And then we could say hp.whisper. This is an alias or an alternate name for helpers. As I mentioned, when you want to use functionality from another module, it's usually best practice to import that entire module like we're doing here. But sometimes it would become tedious to have to write helpers in front of everything. So we can actually say, okay, we're importing that whole module, but in this module, we're going to refer to it as HP. So HP and helpers are the same thing. They're just two aliases, and you could think of these as two names that both reference the same module and the definitions in that module. All right. So let's give one more example here and then talk about what's actually happening behind the scenes to make this all work, at least at a high level. So we can also import names directly from a module, right? So, the name shout isn't in the globals of this particular module, right? If we were to think about what are the names that are in the globals of this module, it's helpers and then any other built-ins, and then HP because we added those two. We can also import functions directly so that we can call those functions directly without having to say, hp.whisper or hp.shout. And this looks pretty similar, but here we're going to say from lessons, which is the package dot example. So we have to reference the actual dot helpers. We have to reference the whole module path here. And then we would say import, and then whatever names we wanted to use. So import shout, import whisper. And then we would be able to say directly, shout hello, imported this function, right? So notice the difference between line 7 and line 16 is because we actually imported the shout function and its name in example of imports, this module is now bound to shout, we can call it directly, okay? So let's try evaluating this module one more time to give us a sense that this is actually the case. So Python m lessons.example of imports, and boom, this functionality was imported, was the first print statement or the first call to shout. We printed the answer, that was 42, it was defined in the other module. And then we used the whisper function, and then we used the shout function directly, all right? There's a lot of intuition as you start using this that hopefully will develop for how these things come together. We define things in one file, we import them into another. But this is a good moment to try and think a little bit more deeply about how might this actually work. And one of the reasons why we put time into understanding memory diagrams is because we have a much better way of understanding how this works, being cognizant of what's going on in these diagrams. I want to go ahead and add one more statement to this file, which is print helpers.py was evaluated. And actually, I want to put this at the very end of the file, right? So there's this print statement. Notice it's at the global level. So we would expect this print statement to run every time this helpers.py file or this module is evaluated. So let's try running that example one more time. Right. Let me just scroll this down. Notice that we ran example of imports, right? So this is the module that we're running. And the first thing that prints is actually this print statement over in helpers.py. So I want to talk through this in two passes. First, just a high-level intuitive pass. So line 4 in example of imports.py, when we go to import a module, in order to do so, Python needs to evaluate that module. And so at this point in the program, what Python's going to do is it's going to go say, okay, let's go evaluate this module. And it's going to do so in the same way we've been evaluating every other module when we do it ourselves by hand, right? There's going to be a globals frame for this particular module. We're going to add entries for the answer, for shout, these definitions. And then when we get to the bottom of it, we're going to print this message because that's in the module. Like it's running this module. The key difference is when you go and you import a module, when that module's evaluation is completed, we go back to this point, and now helpers is going to be, effectively a name for everything that was in the globals frame of that module we just imported. Okay. Let's try just imagining this in a slightly more specific level with a quick diagram. And I want to call out that we won't be diagramming multi-file evaluations throughout this course, but this will hopefully give you a better sense of how this all works, so that some things that can be a little bit magical and mysterious feel less so. All right, so let's imagine we evaluate this file, example of imports. I'm going to abbreviate that to EOI. All right, so EOI .py. Right, it's going to have a stack, and it's going to have a globals frame. Right. I'm going to put the heap way over here. Okay, great. So everything seems fine. We reach line 4, and already we've got to do something funky. We need to go evaluate this other module. All right, well, there's a difference between what is the primary module that's being evaluated and what are other modules being evaluated. And how this works behind the scenes is going to be much more nuanced than we are describing here, but the same intuition will apply. So what I want you to imagine is that, okay, over on the heap, we're actually going to establish a stack for helpers.py. And over here, it's also going to have a globals frame. All right. And in that globals frame, just like we've been doing, we would see that, okay, let's go evaluate this module. Well, we see that there's this constant that's defined. So I've already made my box too small. So there's this constant that is the answer. And that's 42, right? There's the shout function, which is the function. And I'm actually going to draw this arrow down below because all of this winds up being on the heap in kind of a funny and bizarre way. But this is the function that is on lines 6 through 7. And if we wanted to be more specific, we would note that this is in helpers.py, but we'll just assume that we keep track of that. And then there's also the whisper function. And I'll just draw that down here. And that's the function on some other line. So I'll just write n to m because this isn't actually, super important. And we know that that's there. Okay, so we've got our stack here in globals, right? So this is our globals for helpers.py. And when we reach the end of it, there was some output, right? And that output, I'm not going to write it out in its entirety, but it was, helpers.py was evaluated. Okay, so we've fully evaluated this module that we're importing. And then we're going to jump back to where it was imported. All right. So what happens here? So the intuition is after we go and import from lessons this whole module, well, what happens is in this example of imports globals is there's now a name helpers that is accessible in the globals frame of this stack in this py file, and it references the globals of the imported module, right? And this is why when we later say in our program, helpers.shout is helpers, and then we follow the arrow dot, and then shout is this function, and we know exactly where that's defined. And so we're able to map all of this up together, all right? So let's keep it going. And when we call helpers.shout, we would ultimately need to add another frame, and we would actually still be in this stack and working here. We would just be calling ultimately the function that was defined in another file. So I'm going to ignore these function calls, but also when we see helpers.theAnswer, we know, okay, helpers dot, whenever we see a dot, we're following that reference. And then the answer is how we would know that it's 42. And where things get interesting is, well, okay, what happens here? We're importing the same module again, but we're aliasing it. Now, if we look at what actually happened when we ran this program, notice that helpers.py was only evaluated once. This line that's at the very end of this module got printed only once. So that means that module was evaluated only once. Python is keeping track of, oh, we've actually already evaluated this. We've already imported this. We know what is in its global frame. We're not going to do that again. So when we imported and we aliased as HP, what happened was we have another entry in globals that is HP that refers to the names in that globals frame as well. And lastly, when we imported these functions specifically, what happens is we set up references directly to those functions. So this line of code would have the effect of saying, okay, well, in this file, shout is now a name in our globals space, and it's going to refer to the function on line 6 to 7, and whisper is the other function, all right? And that's how we would set up these references. So what's important to recognize is that when you import something like a module, or even a single function in the module, the entire module has to be evaluated in order to establish it. Whenever you import something from another module, that module gets evaluated, and then you're able to reference things inside of that module in the ways that we've shown, right? The key thing to recognize is that anything that you can access must have been defined in globals or at the global space of the module that's been imported. All right, the last example I want to give here, actually, there's one other thing I need to say about this. So oftentimes we would like to be able to have modules that have both functions that we might import in other places, but also make use of those functions in the module itself. The reason why we have this convention, if name is equal to main, I'm actually going to leave this print statement above it and say print helpers.py was evaluated as a module, or was run as a module. And then I'm going to add an else here, which we typically don't do. And we're going to print helpers.py was imported as a module, right? So we've been using this convention of, in our Python files, having if the name, which is sort of a built-in variable that's available to us, is equal to the string main. And then we would call our main function typically in there, but there's nothing special about calling a main function. It's just a convention we use. But here we'll be able to see the difference between importing a module and running a module, right? So let's try running this same example one more time. And notice on line 13, so all right, we're running this module that has our imports. And on line 4, we're importing this entire module. So we need to go evaluate it. Well, what happens is on line 13, helpers.py was evaluated. And then notice the statement that gets printed out was this module was evaluated as, was imported as a module, right? So we've imported it. And that means that name wasn't main. If we printed it out, it would be the module's name, right? So what does this mean? Well, we could also try running this module directly. So Python m lessons.helpers. And we'll see that on line 13, helpers.py was evaluated. And then notice when we ran the program this way, so when we evaluated this module directly and we wanted to run it, as a program, the name variable that's built into Python was automatically set to main. So just to bring this demo home, if we print name here, we'll see what it is when it's not main. And in order to see that, I'm once again going to run my example of imports, and we'll see that when you import a module, this name variable is actually the name of the module in Python's convention. So lessons.helpers was what we saw there. All right. Let's bring this quick demo of importing home by showing you how imports work in Jupyter Notebooks, which is slightly different. And we're going to do this very quickly. Right? So in lessons, I'm going to set up a new Jupyter Notebook, which is example of imports.ipynb. Right? And I'm using the VS Code Jupyter Notebook plugin here. And let's just go ahead and say, and this is where things are going to be a little bit different. All right. So I want to show you why this is a little bit trickier when you're using imports in Jupyter Notebook than in a workspace project. So if I were to say from lessons, import helpers and evaluate this. we get this error. It says no module named lessons. And that seems kind of funny, right? This was working everywhere else. This Python file, this Jupyter Notebook file is in the same directory as everything else. And here's where Jupyter Notebooks have a slightly different convention, without doing a lot of work to work outside of that convention. But the idea here is when you run a Jupyter Notebook and that kernel that we've talked about, it's running inside of the directory that's the same directory or the same package as the Jupyter Notebook. So it doesn't think it's running in the workspace where there's this lessons package and then there's helpers. It just thinks it's running in this top level, or it thinks its top level is the directory it's in, which is inside of lessons. So from here, we would actually just say import helpers, right? So this thinks that, I'm already in the lessons directory, and that's sort of where the root of my kernel is located. So if we import helpers, there we go. We see that this worked. So the key thing to recognize in working with imports in a Jupyter Notebook is that it's going to be looking for modules that are in the same directory as itself, and it's going to be ignorant of the package structure that you might have been using otherwise. There are ways of getting it to not be, but they're not worth jumping through those hoops for our purposes. So we've imported helpers, and now we could say helpers.shout hello. And again, I'm using the control enter to evaluate my cell, or I could use the play button to do so as well. And so this is kind of neat. We can write functions that can be way more complex that we might use across many different Jupyter notebooks, store them in one module, and then import them into our notebooks to be able to use in many different places. All right. So this was a introduction to working with imports in Python. And we saw imports in 3 different contexts and a few different ways of importing, both entire modules as well as specific functions, and some intuition about how what we've been thinking about in terms of a memory model, how that works when we start thinking about importing names from other places in our programs.